then he says to have the hand in the right position, the top of the hand should be aligned with the forearm, because if it's higher, the arrow will land higher. If it's lower, it strikes the hand. So this is the bow hand, right?
Yeah.
So what they're saying is you don't have it up like this.
Yeah.
You have it like that, but you don't have it all the way down like that, because that will cause problems. This thing about having it up like that, there is in several forms of archery, including Korean archery and old-fashioned longbow archery, the concept that if you push with the base of the hand here on the bow grip, it will cause the arrow to go higher. And my experience is pretty much true. If you get a Korean bow, for instance, and you use the Korean grip and you push with the base, you can cause the arrow to hit higher on the target without actually doing anything else. It just changes the geometry of the bow.
Yeah.
In the thing where he says if it's lower, it strikes the hand, that's because it's actually not firmly going over any part of the hand, so the back of the arrow will probably hit the hand. I can't say that I've had that experience. If I turn my hand right down when I'm shooting, it sits on that bone there, and the arrow does, the point of the arrow does. And I find it goes pretty straight. But when someone says something like that, they've probably seen hundreds of archers shoot. And it probably is true. Just because something works for me doesn't mean it's going to work for hundreds of other people. So I think that's quite logical. He says he should draw the training bow very often so that the column of the torso, the body, is strengthened. If the torso is not tight, the deficiencies which were mentioned in grasping the bow handle become evident. So there is a purpose in the training bow beyond simply getting your form right, and that is to strengthen the core of your body. Sorry, it's a little bug flying around here and it's really irritating. Then he goes on to knowing the distance, which is number 7.
Yeah.
To know the distance, if the distance of a high trajectory shooting is 700 steps, this would be probably Gez.
Yes, yeah.
And it's probably like the Turkish Arshin. It's somewhere between 66 and 90 centimeters.
Yeah.
It depends on where you are and what you're talking about. Gezes had variable distances depending on what you were measuring.
Yes.
And it's probable that archers had their own particular version of it.
Yeah.
But this section here is really important because it refers to something that's mentioned in Mahdi al-Tarsusi in the 1100s. It's mentioned in Arab archery in the 1290s. It's even mentioned in Mustafa Khani in the mid-1800s. Because the next thing he says, the distance of the high trajectory shooting is 700 steps. One aims from the ring finger. What he's talking about is elevation. So when you're grabbing the bow, if you aim on the ring finger, you have elevated the point of the arrow the width of your fist.
Oh.
So he says that's the proper distance. That's the proper setting for 700 steps or Gez.
Mm-hmm.
If the trajectory is 600, one aims over the ring finger. Now, bearing in mind there's 2 different aiming systems. There's outside the bow and inside the bow. But you can use the knuckles if you're aiming outside the bow, and you can use the fingers if you're aiming inside the bow. It's basically easier to aim outside the bow if you want to do this because nothing is getting in the way of the knuckles. But if you aim inside the bow, your thumb may be in the way of 2 fingers, depending on how bent it is. If the trajectory is 500 steps, one sights from the middle finger. Again, there. if the distance between you and the enemy is 100 steps, you should look at his mouth.
This is interesting.
Which means, think about it, if your arrow is here,
Yeah.
mustache draw, and you're looking at his mouth, you're actually point blank, you're dead level.
Yes.
If it's at 50 steps, one should look at his beard so that the injuries are effective on the enemy's body, meaning that if you drop it to 50 steps, he's aware the arrow is rising in the first part of its flight because it's not a straight line, it's a trajectory. So therefore, you've got to drop your aim down to his beard because otherwise the arrow will go too high. If you aimed at his, if you're aiming at his mouth, the arrow's going to go over the top of his head. But if you aim at his beard, bear in mind his beard would be, down here somewhere, it's going to hit him in the face, possibly in the eyes.
Yeah.
So this is a variation on this ancient thing about, how you should aim. In Turkish archery, in Mustafa Khani's thing, he's talking about 300 gez, 200 gez, 100 gez.
Ah.
And he says that a normal bow is point blank at 100 gez, and that a very powerful bow is point blank at 300 gez. And years ago when I first read this, I sat down and did the geometry and the trajectories and that, and worked out the rough speeds that the arrow has to be going to get these distances, and to get these elevations. And it was like for the point blank at 300 gez bow, it was over 300 feet per second, which is a fast arrow in anyone's terms. I know that Adam Karpowitz has built bows that shoot above 350 feet per second. I don't know what his latest productions were, but he was making like 150-pound bows or 160-pound bows that were shooting at really high speeds. So, and when you increase the weight of the arrow, the speed goes down, but the kinetic energy doesn't go down, so that the force that the arrow hits with doesn't go down. It just doesn't go as far. So, it's quite a significant thing to have bows that can shoot like this. If the step is actually the length of your foot or something like that, it could be that 700 steps is actually 350 gez, which is bringing it back more to the Turkish measurement. And bearing in mind, when he was talking about stance, he said you had a step between your 2 feet. That would make sense. And then you start looking at these and you're saying, oh, right, well, this is in the same general area as the other ones, but different places the bow shot further or less far. And again, he doesn't mention the weight of the bow here, so you don't know how powerful a bow. We know Persian bows were made really powerful. And then his next statement is really important and very observant. You should know that the oscillation of a man is the oscillation of the arrow. If it oscillates, it will not reach its target. Now, arrows bend around the bow when you shoot them.
Yeah.
The more they bend, the more energy from the arrow is used in straightening it up.
Yeah.
So therefore, if they bend too much, their range reduces, and at what point in their bending they straighten up can affect whether the arrow goes that way or that way. Yes. So the oscillation of the man is the oscillation of the arrow. It may mean that the uncertainty of the man, the vacillation, should I shoot now, should I shoot in a second, whatever, is as dangerous as the oscillation of the arrow. Oh, this next bit. We mentioned entering the bow, which was number 8. Like a cat which wants to catch a mouse and hides, when he enters the bow, he keeps his breath in so that all his body members are alert. He places all his concentration to gain fresh power and 3 gaz seems only like 1 gaz. So things appear closer because he's got the power to reach them.
Yeah.
Now, the interesting thing is, this is one of those rare things where they actually talk about breathing in a Middle Eastern manuscript. And he says he keeps the breath in, so all his body members are alert. When I was in Korea once, a senior Korean archer explained to me that what you should do in breathing, and he was talking about Korean archery, which is different, but has a lot in common in some areas, is that you should hold your stomach in, which for some of us is a big job, and breathe out at the same time, which expands your chest. So you're not using your diaphragm. So you hold your stomach in, suck your stomach in, and breathe in. And because your diaphragm's not moving down as much, your chest is forced to expand, and that locks your shoulders.
Ah, yes, right.
And then when you release, you breathe out. And I think we're looking at something like that here. And because you're not concentrating on breathing in or out, you're completely in and still, your concentration on the target is much more precise because your body's not moving. I mean, you can do this by breathing in as you draw and stopping at full draw.
Yeah.
But he's emphasizing how this improves your focus, which is 3 gaz becomes 1 gaz. When he gets out, he does it, this is number 9, exiting the bow or getting out of the bow. He does it in a way that 1 gaz looks like 10 gaz, so that the enemy fears, respects, and awes the arrow of the man. The arrow should fly fast because effectiveness is in flying fast. And in placing it, he should not place himself in its way. Now, this is, in the former one, he's saying with your concentration, you're focusing in.
Yeah.
In the latter one, he's saying when you release, you should be getting the most out of the arrow. So instead of 1 gaz, it's 10 gaz. And this is terrifying the enemy because they think they're out of range and you hit them.
Yeah.
The other thing is, the last sentence, or last 2 sentences, is the arrow should fly fast because effectiveness is in flying fast. The higher the velocity, the more energy.
Yeah.
The more energy, the more damage that's done.
Yeah.
There are limits on this. You can get a very high velocity with a very light arrow and it won't do a lot of damage because it doesn't have enough mass. It loses too much energy in the flight. The people, even as late as the 1700s, knew this because it's directly observable. You don't have to do calculations to work this out. You can go out in the field with 4 arrows of 4 different weights and shoot them from the same bow at a piece of wood or even an earth butt. And depending on how deep they go in, tells you how effective they're going to be. And in placing it, he should not place himself in its way. Basically, don't draw your arrow so it's going to go into your hand or in the belly of the bow or whatever.
That's it.
These just basic, don't be stupid, be sensible, just gets thrown in. And then he goes, to exit the bow, which is really in the same thing here. It's like a lion which runs out of a house. The arrow should exit the bow limbs when shooting deliberately and releasing the bowstring. So shooting deliberately is that concentration on aim. It's not the really fast shot because something suddenly popped up in front of you. Shooting deliberately means you're aiming precisely, and maybe you're taking 1 or 2 seconds to do it. And releasing the bowstring, which comes after that.
And
So
it's interesting, Bede. He enters the bow like a cat and he exits like a lion. Cat turns into a lion.
Yeah. And the thing is, why even in the 1700s, lions were still quite common in Iran and in the Middle East in general.
Yeah.
I mean, the last lion was killed in Saudi Arabia in 1910.
Yeah.
So lions are a thing people would know. I mean, you might not have personally seen a lion, or you might have seen a lion in the Shah's menagerie or something like that. but it's a concept that's well known because lions kill your sheep, or whatever, or your relatives if you're really unlucky. This thing, well, how does a lion come out of a house? Well, a lion goes into a house looking for food or shelter and comes out of a house when the people come home, because he suddenly realizes it's a dangerous place and that smell was human smell and I better get out of there. So he's going to do it really fast. He's not going to do it really proud and I'm a lion, you better look out. He's going to run away. And so therefore he's saying that this releasing should be fast.
Yeah.
The aiming is deliberate, but the releasing is fast.
Yeah.
Now he goes on to, well, that's interesting because I think that also covers drawing the bow with full force.
Yeah.
But also, this is shooting slowly, shooting with speed. Shooting slowly is going to aim. Shooting with speed is a fast release. Shooting slowly is in an archery competition, concentrating on your target. Shooting quickly is when you're out hunting and a deer suddenly jumps up in front of you and you have to be able to draw and shoot in one go.
Yeah.
It's got more than one meaning. We don't know what he thinks is the most important. To have adequate equipment, which is part of 12, so that the arm of the bow has not gone to the ear and the arrow is not twisted. So the arm of the bow going to the ear, that there is, particularly in Persian bows, there's a noticeable difference in angle where the gushe or ear comes out of the khane or arm of the bow.
Yeah.
They're not a smooth transition like they are in some Ottoman bows.
Yeah.
And this is not all Persian bows. It's particularly noticeable in Shah Kham bows and some of the war bows that have survived. So what he's saying is you don't want what the Turks call the Kasan eye. You don't want that to collapse into a straight line because that means the bow is wrecked. And the arrow is not twisted. A bent arrow is what he's talking about. Now, there is a possibility the two verbs got mixed up when this is written down, and he meant that the arrow is not bent and the bow arm is not twisted, but it's written this way, so that's how we have to interpret it.
Yeah.
A non-straight arrow is not going to reliably hit the target. It may, in fact, break as you shoot it, which is even worse. Then he goes on to the next part. Well, it's not. It's the he skips the having right clothing, and he goes on to getting acquainted with archery. To get acquainted with archery, an archer needs these 12 principles, which he's just mentioned, including getting acquainted with archery. And a beginner should draw the training bow for a required time, and after that, one shoots with a harder training bow so that the hands get strong. You need to know the thumb protector. The ring of the thumb protector should not be very wide or very narrow. That is, it should fit your hand. I've got one here. It won't fall off, but on the other hand, it's easy to move. So it's got to be a good fit.
Yeah.
And then he says, if it's wide, the arrow flies scattered. Now, if he's talking about the actual width from side to side of the ring, if it is too wide, the string is somewhat distorted going around it.
Yeah.
And the knock of the arrow can be pushed or there could be pressure on it. He said it flies scattered if it's too wide. And if it's narrow, the arrow flies freely. So what he's saying, very wide, very narrow are bad. Increased width causes the arrow to scatter, but if you get it down narrow, but not very narrow, the arrow flies freely, which means that when you release, the arrow is not pushed out of line. See, one of the things that you notice when you're shooting with a thumb ring is that you can turn the hand that way, which this part of the hand will push on the string. You can turn the hand that way, which means this part of the hand is free of the string. The idea is you don't want the hand rubbing on the string when you release. Otherwise, you injure the hand and you deflect the string. So you want to be able to turn the hand far enough around that the string has got a free path when you release, but not so far around that it gets behind the ring and slows when it comes out. There's no easy way to write this down. This would have been the kind of thing that the master showed you.
Yeah.
But if you've shot enough with the thumb ring, you kind of know the things that go wrong, because almost everything that goes wrong happens to the individual archer. They also say the thumb protector should not be long or short, and the side of the thumb protector should not be thin. And it should not be very thick, and it should be the right size. So essentially, if this, the lip, sometimes called dimak, if it's too long, then you can't form a lock with your thumb, because it holds the thumb away from the ring touches your middle finger, but your thumb doesn't. It's being held too far away because the tip is too long. If it's too short, your thumb turns over the top of it when you lock, and you flick the tip of your thumb when you release, which is painful and distracting. So once you know something's going to hurt you, even if it's a small hurt, you flinch, and that flinching ruins your accuracy. He also said the size of the thumb protector should not be too thin. I think he's referring to the width here, particularly on the DMAC at the base, so that it's holding the string off the thumb. There's no part of the flesh of the thumb that's in the path of the string. He could be referring to the physical thickness of the ring, but my experience is that I've used rings that were 1 millimeter thick up to rings that were thicker than this one, which is at the base where the thumb fits in this section here, is probably, wait a minute, I have some kind of measuring tool here, is okay, that's roughly 4.5 millimeters. So this is not a particularly thick ring. There's classes of ring that are thicker than this, but you don't want to have an excess in the base of it or too little. But that's not as important as whether the ring is wide enough. And I think that's the thickness or thinness he's talking about. But I could be wrong. And there might have been rings that were made particularly thin, or they may have narrowed right down into here. Korean rings, not the ones that you see sold as plastic rings, but the old horn rings, often were thickest at the tip and narrowest at the base, because the Korean technique was slightly different. And there's on some of these old rings, I've got one, there's a line scratched into the lip of the ring so that you don't let the string get too close to the base, so it doesn't have leverage to force the ring into the hand. This is different styles. So he's talking about one style, but there are other styles that work differently. Now he says, about the art of archery, which is, he's talking about getting acquainted with archery. He lists a number of points, quite a large number of points when you actually get down to it. I didn't number them. They were just too long. The first one is to correct the bow. That means an archer should know how to straighten his bow. If composite bows will tend to drift depending on how they were glued together. So I mean, I had bows that you had to twist the tips after every shot, because they would start to curve out of the plane. His next one is to, and I'm sorry, I should go into a little bit more detail. Correcting the bow is done with pressure and heat. If it's a minor thing, you can just do it with pressure. If it's more serious, you heat it over a dull charcoal brazier or something until it feels just warm enough, and then you gently correct it. It says to enter the bow in an open posture. Now this could be really very relevant to modern archers. I am guessing that from what we understand, entering the bow is drawing the bow.
Yeah.
And with an open posture is not like this, like this.
Yeah.
But considering the order this is done in, the next one is to take up the arrow. So it could be simply he might mean picking up the bow so that the bowstring is not too close. So you've got a slight angle so the bowstring is not too close to your wrist. I don't know. But certainly whatever it means, either one of those are important things. Taking up the arrow, how to pick up an arrow, because a lot of target shooting was done with the arrows either in your sash or on the ground. If you were doing one of the stances that involved kneeling, you generally would have the arrows laying flat on the ground next to you, and you would pick them up and then you would knock them. If you were standing, you may well have the arrows in your sash. If you were in battle, you would have them in a quiver. So the ability to take an arrow out of your sash, off the ground, or out of a quiver is important, because this is how you actually use it, whether in target competition or in fighting. Fighting is probably more important that you have a smooth method of doing this, because otherwise things could go horribly wrong. Focus the view. This almost certainly means to bring your concentration into what you're doing. It could also mean look at your target and note where it is. It could mean both quite easily, because you've got to be aware of where your target is. You can't, draw your bow and then determine where the target is. There are circumstances when this would be done, like, for instance, if you're hiding behind a shield and you get ready and you draw your bow and shoot all in one action. But he's not talking about that. So I'm guessing that he means to concentrate and take into account where the target is. The next one is to hide the chest, which caused us some troubles when this was translated. I now think it means to turn sideways. Not necessarily your whole body, just your upper body. So you turn at the waist, and that means your shoulder is facing the target, not your chest. That minimizes the target you make to your enemy. It's like in fencing, where you try and minimize the areas your enemy can strike at. I mean, if you've got a shield, you're quite happy to face the person you're fighting with the sword. But if you've just got a sword, you want to make sure that there's not a lot of view for them to hit without too much trouble. To keep the torso upright. This is really common in Persian archery manuscripts, that you should be straight and upright and your back straight, and you're not supposed to be tensing or anything like that. You're not stressing, but you should be upright, because if you're upright, it's easy to align your shoulders. With your shoulders aligned, it's easy to draw heavy bows, because heavy bows were the ultimate of all of this training, is to get you to be able to shoot bows that you can do real damage with. Tighten the grasp. Now, what we're talking about, in modern archery, you shoot with a loose hand. And partially this is to accommodate the way bows are built now. It was part of a developmental process from the, I think, 30s or 40s into the 60s, where they gradually went from a tight grip, which was used on longbows and composite bows, to a loose grip for bows with shaped handles and everything like that. Now, that is specifically to maximize the efficiency of those bows. It is not necessarily of any advantage when you're using a composite bow or a longbow, for that matter. So you want the grasp tight, because you don't want the bow moving. You don't want to release and have the bow rotate in your hand out of control. In Japanese archery, the bow rotates in the hand, but it's in control. It might not be conscious control, but the archer knows what's going on. He says to lock the 3 fingers and the thumb around each other. I am almost certain that he's talking about the drawing hand. Lock the 3 fingers. Are those 3 fingers? and the thumb is pressing the thumb into the middle finger. The index finger is the only finger that's not tight, and it's the only one I'm guessing he is not mentioning here. He doesn't say which three fingers, but any archer brought up in this tradition would assume he means the middle finger, ring finger, and little finger. Then he says, tense the arm. Almost certainly that's the left arm.
Yeah.
Because you lock it and tense it. Even if you're drawing with the bow in front of you, you don't kind of do that. You basically rotate the arm on your elbow and push forward when you're at full draw. You notice how I just instinctively raised my shoulder there? That's really the wrong thing to do. Raise the elbows. So basically the elbows start out low and you raise them when you're doing this.
Yeah.
Align the thumb and the arrowhead. So in my mind, this is talking about the drawing hand, thumb, and the arrowhead, so that you have them in a straight line. Now you might say, oh, they're always in a straight line, but if you take into account the right elbow, the straight line is from the right elbow through the hand, through the thumb, along the arrow to the arrow point. That's what I think he's talking about. He could mean drawing until the arrowhead is on the thumb of the bow hand, which is equally reasonable. So with these things, they're not unambiguous, and the two versions in this case both make sense. And it could be, that's what he means. He means both at the same time. This one is one that I remember from a friend who was a teacher in Japanese archery. Keep pulling right to the end. You never let your hand move forward. You're always stretching.
Yeah.
And so, you know, you're drawing to the lobe of your ear. You're always stretching. You never do this. I don't know if this is coming across, but this collapse that happens sometimes. Tighten the back. Next thing, tighten the back is exactly what you do as you release.
Yeah.
I mean, the back is all aligned, and then you kind of pull the shoulder blades together, which pulls your hand off the string.
Yeah.
Though you're doing a lot of other things. Trim and shave the beard, eyebrows, and eyelashes. Honestly, I'm not sure what he means here. This could be just look nice, or, I mean, to be funny, to be not serious for a second, he might be talking like the Chinese masters in the martial arts movies with the really long eyebrows. Could be dangerous. There's a famous story that the great Seljuk Sultan Alp Arslan had mustaches that were so long that he tied them behind the back of his head when he shot, so they wouldn't get caught by the bowstring. So he might be talking about the fact that your beard could get in the way, or your mustaches could get in the way of the bowstring. It might be as simple as that. And I think that's the most likely thing. I'm just not sure about the eyelash.
I have to say, we used that. I mean, okay, Mr. Weigel, I hope he's not going to be angry. The former Ministry of Financial Affairs in Germany, and Mr. Weigel had eyebrows, and they were so long, and everyone said, "Why isn't he trimming it?" Because it was really long, you know, like one of those, you know, cartoons. I don't remember who this guy had, like, you know, exactly.
It is a feature some people have, and maybe that's what he's talking about.
Yeah.